So, good morning. Thank you all for coming. Okay, I think we're ready to start, if that's okay. So, how elevating diverse voices and perspectives drive impact in our reporting around human rights and development issues is what we're here to talk about. Our panel here on my right is Jamie Wilson. He himself has reported from many different parts of the world, including conflict zones, and for the past decade has been the head of international news at The Guardian, based in London. Kenneth Mohammed has lived and worked in the UK, in Africa, and his native Caribbean, working for major corporations, including Microsoft, Coca-Cola, and Trinidad's National Oil Company. He's now moved into academia and journalism, with an interest in corruption and development and how the two are interlinked. Mary Harper is a journalist and author specialising in Africa and is Africa editor for the BBC World Service, as well as the author of 2 books on Africa. And my name is Tracy McVeigh, and I'm the editor of all the foundation and philanthropic funded editorial projects at The Guardian, also based in London. So we're here essentially to discuss what we should be including in our reporting, who we should be including, and how we can best serve our audiences at home and in the places we are reporting from. The developing world is a very complex place, and the Western media, as we are always accused of treating it in a simplistic manner, making it a story of bad people and good people, and not really reflecting those nuances in between, and of perhaps not including as many Indigenous viewpoints as we should. I'd like to make this panel a conversation, so we will try and leave as much time as possible for questions at the end. So we'd really welcome some interaction from you all, please. Diverse perspectives is what we're here to discuss, so please do feel towards the end that questions are very welcome. So first of all, we're going to start with Mary. As the member of our panel with perhaps the most experience herself in reporting from the African continent. So, Mary, have we ignored more diverse voices in the past, perhaps with a view to keeping the story that we want to tell to a Western audience less complicated?
Absolutely, yes. And when I think about my career as a BBC journalist, which has been for a very long time, pretty much 30 years. I first started working for a programme called Focus on Africa that was only broadcast to Africa. Most of the staff were from the continent or who had a very, very close relationship with it. And that programme, we definitely did include most of the reporters on the ground were from the country that they were reporting from, and we did report very nuanced, detailed news about Africa to an African audience, and it was required listening by lots of people on the continent. But as my career has developed through the BBC, I now report on Africa for an African audience, a global audience, and a domestic British audience. And the closer you get to the domestic audience, the more simplistic, and I would actually use the word not just unfair, but almost dishonest the coverage of Africa becomes. So once you get to the domestic audience, really the stories they want about Africa are the ones that fit into these stereotypes, which we all know them so well: famine, war, disease, and in the case of Somalia, pirates as well for a while. And it got to the point where I actually quite often refused to do the stories that I'm asked to do by domestic BBC, because I'm just like, this is such an unfair way of covering the continent. And I'll just give one quick example before I end. In Mogadishu, in Somalia, there's a spot where, when there was more active fighting in the city, there's a spot where a journalist can stand, and depending on where the camera is pointing, in that very same spot, you can either get the journalist with lots and lots of displaced people living in the most horrific conditions in basically little structures they've made out of old plastic sheeting. So you get the sort of starving people thing. If the camera was in another direction, you would get the the fighting going on. And then in another direction, there was like this extraordinary images of a city shattered by 30 years of conflict. But yet, if that journalist had just moved a little bit and gone a little bit further, they would have seen all sorts of other things going on in Somalia. But it's like, because that's the story they're expected to tell, they're blinded to everything else that's going on.
Kenneth, so also lived in Africa, but here really to talk about the Caribbean. I mean, how do you think the global north, the Western media, writes about and actually understands the region? What are we missing?
I think I have to endorse what Miri has said. Oftentimes, it's sticking to the stereotype and the dominant narrative. The Caribbean is often seen as a place for a long-haul holiday with fantastic beaches. And the real news stories you will find focus on maybe Haiti, with all the conflict and violence going on there, or focus on Central America, and the politics and the corruption and all that. But there's a lot more to the Caribbean and Africa. For example, drawing links between the Caribbean and Africa is, I think, important when we're reporting. Focusing on commercial and trade activities and some of the wonderful things that's happening in the Caribbean. You don't get that in the news. In fact, the Caribbean is often seen as being inconsequential, not very substantive in terms of news reporting. People want to report on conflict and corruption and these things. But there's a lot to be said, especially recently I wrote an article about the UN's blacklisting of the Caribbean countries, specifically relating to money laundering. And when you think about it, yes, there's drug trafficking coming through Colombia into the Caribbean, and then it goes either in the US or in direction of the UK. Why isn't these North American countries on that list? Especially when we know that places like London is where all the money laundered funds are parked. So I have to agree with that narrative that we need to really look at underreported areas and stop overlooking issues. That in turn will build trust with communities in the Caribbean. I often looked at, when you speak to other people in the Caribbean or in Africa, they cringe at some of the media houses in Europe because they expect to hear that same story being told over and over. So I think we need to be more inclusive and representative of what we're talking about.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that sort of cringing is probably quite familiar to any of us who've done any reporting, especially in Africa, where you speak to local people and they're obviously generally very cross about the way their country is represented abroad. So Jamie, how The Guardian has obviously developed now into a kind of global international media organisation. Are you comfortable that we are currently properly reflecting the perspectives of the Global South?
It might be helpful for me just to start a little bit with the sort of Guardian's journey over the last sort of 20 years or so. I first joined the Guardian news desk in 2006, and at that time, I would have said the Guardian was closer to sort of where the Guardian was in 1821 to where it's gone in the 20 years since. At that point we were a British newspaper, writing entirely for a British audience. There was a website. It was on the 5th floor. Nobody ever went up there. It was there was almost no communication between the paper and the website at that point. And then at this point, we now have 3 global hubs. We have obviously a big newsroom in London, we have a newsroom in New York, and we have a newsroom in Sydney, and we baton pass the news around the world. We have 4 international front pages. There's a UK front page, an Australia front page, a US front page, and an international front page. And the international is the second biggest read of those, of all of those, and that that's what you get here in Italy, and it's what you get if you're reading The Guardian in Africa, or whether you're reading The Guardian in the Caribbean. And so I think we have definitely had to learn to write for a very different audience to the one we were writing for in 2006. And that audience is, what we write now has to be able to be read everywhere, basically, because we're writing for so many different audiences that our coverage really has to be able to be read everywhere, where you can get The Guardian. Are we doing enough in terms of diverse voices? Of course we can do more, and we should do more, and we need to do more, and it's certainly something that we talk about a lot. Tracy and I talk about a lot. Tracy is the editor of our global development and sort of philanthropic arms. Do you want me to talk a little bit about kind of how we interact between our...
Yep, that'd be great.
I mean, so I run the news. So what I do is quite live fire. It involves, obviously a lot of wars, a lot of sort of what's happening on a daily basis. What Tracy runs, and we've set this up, I think about more than a decade ago now, is this sort of philanthropic arm of The Guardian, which allows us to do much deeper dives into the global south, into global health, into those areas which we weren't really reporting on before, but that's now become incredibly important to us. When we first started this sort of journey, quite a lot of the content coming out of the sort of global development side was a little bit niche. It was a little bit kind of sort of UN press releases, I guess, felt a little bit like that. Since then, we've really changed what the output is from those teams, and it's now very much giving a voice to the global south and to people living there. So that's,
Thank you. I mean, I just add to that as well that a very practical step that I take as an editor is if I get a story or a pitch that arrives on my computer screen and it doesn't have those voices in that story, if I get a story, even if it's a story about a UN report or anything, and it does not have a voice or a quote from an Indigenous person from that country, it goes back to the reporter. It's just as basic as that. So I wonder if, maybe can start with Mary, if there's, how can we work better? What are the very practical steps that we could do to work better?
I think the first thing is to have more respect from people from whatever country you're reporting on, and not assume that their journalism is going to be worse, is going to need lots and lots of work, that they're going to come up with story ideas that nobody in the sort of Western or global audience is going to be interested or understand. And at the moment, I'm working very closely with a new all-women Somali media house that was set up exactly a year ago. And what has been so great about them, because they are telling very, very different stories about their country than what you get from some journalist who's propelled in. And I would say thank you very much to The Guardian in particular, because they publish their stories. And one of Tracy's colleagues, one of the sort of best things I've heard from an editor, what she said, was that when they produce their stories for The Guardian, we're not going to Guardianize their stories and put them through that filter. Whichever way those journalists want to tell the story, of course, the English and the way it's presented has to be perfect, but if they're telling it in a way from a perspective that isn't like your typical Guardian story, that's fine. And I think that is the best way at the moment to have more voices, because they do need to be amplified, and the only way that's going to happen is if they do appear more on these big global news outlets like The Guardian, like the BBC, like the New York Times. And it's unfortunate that those big, powerful media houses are all in the global north, if that's how you want to describe it. But that is the reality right now. So I think that is an effective way of getting those voices out into the world, is distributing them as widely as you can, at the same time giving those stories the respect and not try to sort of put them through some kind of filter or machine to make them look like any other story.
Yeah, and again, just add that that's actually a bit of a challenge for an editor in any media outlet, because you are trusting your audience. You know, you're trusting your audience that you are slightly differing from what can be a quite formulaic way of presenting news. So I wonder, Kenneth, trust in an audience, I mean, why are those connections between North and South and how we report them so important? And how can we gain trust in both sides of the hemispheres, both hemispheres, sorry?
Yeah, I think it's important, more important nowadays in this world of misinformation, and especially with AI coming in, that a more balanced and nuanced view of stories coming out of the Caribbean, Africa, Asia is important. I think as well, building trust in the way you report is very important, because historically there's been little trust in the way stories have been reported. You know, so it requires a commitment to listening and understanding and standing in the shoes of those reporters and understanding where they're coming from. There should also be ethical considerations, you know, to be responsible and respectful to the culture you're reporting on. And we've seen many examples of disrespect and kind of irresponsible journalism. I think building relationships of trust. For example, The Guardian recently commissioned historical research into their slavery origins, being funded by slave plantation in the Caribbean, Jamaica, I think it was. And Western media took it to task that The Guardian was wrong in doing that, but I think it was extremely courageous to put themselves on the front line to do this, because it built such currency in the Caribbean, such goodwill, that it was being reported as well all over there, but in a favorable stance. And I think I felt it was incredibly courageous for The Guardian to do that. And I think something like that builds so much trust.
Thank you. Jamie, I mean, that's quite nice to hear for us. But obviously...
I can talk a little bit more about that if you want. I mean, just a little bit more background on that. This is a project that was... it came out of the 2021 was the 200th anniversary of The Guardian, and kind of the Guardian's sort of origin story previously had been kind of quite heroic. It came out of the Peterloo massacre. It was set up by this man, John Edward Taylor, kind of as a response to this very, very heavy-handed crackdown, and it kind of, took off as a kind of liberal newspaper at that point. But obviously, as we were looking at the anniversary, the Guardian is originally called the Manchester Guardian, and Manchester was a city that was built on the cotton trade, and it doesn't take much when you sort of scratch the surface to realise that the cotton trade was built on the slave trade. So this was a piece of work that was commissioned around about the time of the anniversary by the Scott Trust, which is the independent owners of The Guardian, to have a proper look at how the kind of Guardian came into being, and that piece of work, which was published a couple of months ago now, found that kind of the sort of 10 backers of the original owner of The Guardian, most of them had links to the slave trade. As a result of that, the Scott Trust has promised to spend 10 million in restorative justice over the next decade or so to try and make good on some of that. And part of that is going to be putting more journalists into Africa, putting more journalists into the Caribbean, or I shouldn't say putting into, I should say hiring more journalists in those places. So that's one of the things that we're doing kind of going forwards to try and sort of reset that balance somewhat.
Thank you. I think the issue of kind of reparations is something that we've been tackling about how we report on as well, because again, that is something that you can't report on unless you have those diverse voices in, because those viewpoints all really matter. I wonder, I mean, I'll open for questions in a wee second, but Kenneth, I wonder if there's anything in particular you wanted to sort of say about the way Western media have been looking at reparations and our understanding of them, and whether there's a real disconnect between how that subject is seen in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I think yeah, sorry about that. His recent visit to the Caribbean, I think Prime Minister Holness, he said to him, it's time to move on from having the Queen as the head of state. And I think the irony of that statement was lost on him, because go backwards to when David Cameron visited Jamaica, he said, you know, let's not talk about reparations, let's move on. You know, we're terribly sorry for slavery and all that, but let's move on. So there was a bit of irony in there. Reparations seems to be a dirty word, you know, but what people need to understand is how that generational ladder of wealth has been broken between Africa and the Caribbean. And it's important, I think the Guardian has recognized it, it's important that certain things are done. And it doesn't need, I remember one economist saying it's going to be the biggest transfer of wealth if that ever happens. You know, so what? I mean, it doesn't have to be, you know, it can take many different forms. It can take forms of scholarships, education, healthcare, loads of other ways it can happen. Another argument is that reparations will just be siphoned out through corruption and that kind of stuff. But the important thing is to build those mechanisms into, you know, all of this. So it's not going to happen overnight. But I think that really needs to come out in the open and be discussed with some sort of maturity and trust.
Thank you. And Mary, just to quickly touch on the issue of corruption as well, which is obviously a huge issue around the world, not just in Africa, but I think perhaps through the Western kind of media lens, people might be forgiven for thinking that Africa is the only place in the world with any corruption. How do we kind of get that balance right in our reporting? How do we make sure that we are covering corruption, but we are not saying this is all that's happening here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is a sort of, I suppose, another stereotype and an assumption that all African presidents are very, very corrupt, that they get into power basically for money. And I've certainly seen that is the case, for example, in Angola, where Kenneth has worked. Ministers, because they knew that they'd only have that portfolio for 2 or 3 or 4 years before they were booted out, and they did literally, I've seen it with my own eyes, they just saw it as a way to fill suitcases with money and enrich themselves. They really, that was kind of almost like the primary motivation. So you can't ignore that there are cases like that, but to presume that Africa is more corrupt than anywhere else it's very unfair, because also there hasn't been a huge amount of really, really deep investigations into corruption in Africa. So it's just sort of said like a throwaway comment. And when you speak to people on the continent about what's going on, like, for example, everything that's happened in British politics over the past few years, they're just like, this is much worse than my country. With all the Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and all the nonsense that was going on. And it's like, why do they call what we do corruption, and they use other labels for it when they're talking about people in places like Europe and the US? Because they are essentially doing the same thing, maybe in a slightly different way.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a Zimbabwean journalist a few months ago howling with laughter when I tried to talk to him about corruption in his government, when the British government was in disarray. I wonder if anybody would like to ask some questions of anyone in the panel. I think there is a microphone somewhere, I hope. Do you want to just try yelling out?
Yeah. This. I normally work in China, where I've been for the past 3 years, and the situation there for journalists and harboring and encouraging diversity is a lot more difficult for numerous political reasons. And for me, coverage seems to be so intertwined now with geopolitics that it's very hard to really represent people in the way that they would want to be represented. I just wonder how your separate institutions deal with trying to balance encouraging diversity and representing people's viewpoints, but also, sorry, hold on. I'm trying to remember how I was phrasing this. But also trying to not lean into oversimplified stereotypes of a country which you're meant to be documenting as a supposed enemy.
I'm sorry, Jamie, I'm going to throw it onto you. I mean, China's a fantastic example, actually. You know, we haven't touched on that, but obviously an incredibly difficult place to report. And Jamie can maybe talk about the problems we've had in reporting from there.
Yeah, the first problem is getting a visa for us. That's been incredibly, you know, the sort of, we haven't had a staff reporter in China since before COVID now. That's right, yeah. But unfortunately, you know, I'm very much hoping that we will have a full-time Amy Hawkins, who's our China correspondent. She's currently in London. I'm very much hoping that she'll be getting a visa soon, but it's no guarantee. Yeah, since COVID, they really shut the door in terms of, and it, you know, what we've seen increasingly in China, and I have to say now, unfortunately, in Russia, is a real hostility to Western media organisations and allowing us to report in any way on the ground. Even people who, even organisations that do have correspondents there find it incredibly difficult to report. People are very fearful of speaking to them as well, which makes it incredibly difficult. So it's a really difficult place to report from at the moment. You know, Amy is, you know, her parents are Chinese, so she speaks the language. She spent a lot of time in China, which can be, I think, you know, obviously now it makes a big difference because it's very difficult to find fixers to work with there because, again, they're very fearful of working with correspondents. No.
Yeah, because obviously that fear is huge, is a huge part of trying to include diverse voices in our reporting as well. And that's something we haven't actually talked about, but of course risk to individuals who you're talking to in places like China and now in Russia, you know, that risk is something that has to be considered on a story-by-story basis, of course.
Hi. Hello. Hi. I was what you were saying, Mary, about this idea of stories going through a filter to make them kind of more palatable for a domestic audience in the UK or in the US or international, whatever. But I'm curious for your perspective, Jamie, running kind of the daily news grind and the front pages. How do you kind of square that, like clicks and all of that with being true to the stories of the people that we want to represent?
Well, as I kind of said, we kind of have two streams at The Guardian. We have the news, which is what I do, and then we also have our global development side and our philanthropic arm, which does allow us to have a much deeper dive. Clicks is a tricky one. We're not all about clicks. People think all news organisations are now. That isn't the case. Obviously, traffic is important to us. We want our journalism to be read as far and wide as we possibly can. So of course we measure our metrics, but we don't commission by clicks. So we don't commission just because one story is done well or one story is done really badly. That doesn't mean to say that going forwards we won't commission a similar story, or we would commission, or we'll just commission the stories that are getting clicks. That's not how we work at The Guardian. I know some other news organisations probably do work like that, but that's not what we do. So.
Yeah, and to sort of add to that, I would be surprised if Jamie even knew the traffic on a regular basis on the stories that he's putting out, because in an organisation, and I am going to blow our own trumpet, in an organisation at The Guardian, we have journalists who know what an important story is and what a good story is, and the balance of stories that we need to be putting out, because we have to be putting out factual stories, important stories of the day. We also have to be putting out stories that are interesting, that will make people kind of go, oh, the fancy that story, that's important, because that's important to give people a rounded daily read, if you like. But clicks, as a journalist, and I'm sure most of us in this room know as a journalist what is a good story, and your readers will reflect that, and you will get the readership because you've written it well, and you've done your bit, I feel. And Mary, yeah.
When I heard you saying that Jamie doesn't know his traffic, that was really refreshing for me to hear, because at the BBC, when I do a story for BBC Online, I'm not sort of informed, or nobody really reacts internally to whether it was an interesting story. They're like, oh, Mary, your story got this many thousand clicks. And that is like a successful story. That's how things are measured. And also in terms of if it's read for 1 minute and 9 seconds, that means they've read it to the end. And that seems to be a big measure now of the success of stories. And I find it very uncomfortable, especially when the BBC is supposed to be a public service broadcaster, that I kind of feel it doesn't matter if a story gets 1/10 of the clicks. If it's an important story that should be reported, and it's very unfortunate that it seems to be driven by the clicks rather than good journalism.
One of the things I think how you measure diverse voices and perspectives and stories is looking at the spread of readership. So stories I've seen people reading in Vanuatu, as far as the Canadian diaspora, probably for the Caribbean, US diaspora. I think that is a good measure to see if diverse stories or voices are getting out there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, we do have internal metrics at The Guardian, of course we do, but I like to think we use them a wee bit more to exactly as Kenneth says, where the stories go, are people what are people more interested in than other things? That, I hope, that's the aim. Anybody else?
Can you hear me? Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, thanks so much to the panel. This was a really great discussion today. I'd love to hear just maybe 1 or 2 stories that you're particularly proud of, where you felt like you got those diverse voices correct, or that you were really proud of the representation that was in them. Tracy, I'll defer to you on who should answer that question, but I'd love to just know some of those stories that you resonate with you.
Thank you. I'm the moderator. I seem to be talking, but I mean, what I've just done with my department is I put out a newsletter, a monthly newsletter called Her Stage, which is entirely voices from the Global South. I just turned down a photographer from Turkey. I mean, it's stories of women from the Global South by women from the Global South. It's photography by women from the Global South. It's entirely kind of theirs, and I would like to move to a point where it can be guest edited as well. It's only just started, so we're not there yet. But I'd like to get each point where it's guest edited. But a lot of the stuff we do in Global Dev we did a trip to Somalia last year. Every single voice in the piece was a Somalian resident, didn't use any of the... And the NGOs who are on the ground are not happy about that. They would quite like to be, as Mary knows, to have their voices in there for their donors and all the rest of it. But I think we have to draw a line, and we have to make sure that we're doing that as best we can. And as Mary said, collaboration as well is something we really are starting to think a lot more about, collaborating with Indigenous media houses in country. Is there anything you'd like to add? Yeah, Kenneth.
I'd like to add to that. I think one story that resonated with me was the way The Guardian reported on the Windrush scandal. And if you live in the UK, you'll understand it was this whole movement where Caribbean immigrants had come, I think in the late 60s or 50s, and were now being subjected to producing documents for them to stay, and some were being deported. And the way The Guardian handled it by, reporting personal testimonies, activists, and all that, it gave a complete coverage of the issue, which then have led to change.
Yeah, I'll mention a couple of things, if you don't mind. First, I'd like to talk about the Pacific Project, which is something that we set up in 2019. This is predominantly run out of our Australian office, and it's the idea of it was to very much give build a network of Indigenous journalists across the Pacific, which is an incredibly underreported region. And so, yeah, we now have journalists that are writing for The Guardian from islands right the way across the Pacific, and producing some incredibly interesting journalism, and also some really impactful global journalism, in the sense that China's taking a real interest in the Pacific now, and actually we've got some exclusives on what China's been doing there, which has been great for us in news terms. And then the other thing I wanted just to mention, but Tracy needs to jump back in on this one again as well, is just our Afghanistan reporting, which we through Tracy's team, but working collaboratively with the news team, we had a lot of women writers working for us in Afghanistan and writing for us from Afghanistan, kind of during the time when the Americans and British were leaving, the Taliban were taking over, and they told incredibly powerful stories, and I don't think we were seeing those anywhere else really. And I think we were very proud to have those stories in The Guardian.
Mary, is there anything you'd like to add to
that? As an example of giving space to diverse voices, for example, the BBC Africa website, they have something called Letter from Africa. So every week, a journalist from the continent will write kind of whatever they want to write about, and they generally write about things that are unexpected, at least from a Western perspective. They're off agenda, and they're very refreshing. But I do think that you have to be careful, because if you give certain kind of special places for these voices, you are ghettoizing them at the same time. And it should be that as many voices as possible, and I'm not against the idea of having journalists from Western journalists being parachuted in somewhere and telling their version of the story, as long as that's just one bit of the coverage and it's not given any particular privilege in relation to other voices. The more voices, the better. And one thing, for example, with these Somali women who I'm working with this organisation called Bilan, when we were setting it up, because they're all women, I and they, we had a big discussion about it's not about telling stories about women. If that comes into their coverage, fine, but they're doing news from their country. And what's been interesting, because there was a study done, there's about 900 Somali news websites in existence, and generally they do just focus on politics and the conflict. And these women journalists, they could have done that if they wanted, but interestingly, they have only done one story about politics. And when they do stories, because the conflict is very pervasive about the conflict, they tell really different stories than the ones you would get from a sort of journalist, mainstream journalist going in and talking about everybody fighting. Like they've just done one recently about people who recently fled an area of fighting, and they've ended up in a settlement outside Mogadishu, and they went to speak to them about the fighting, but in fact what they came back with was like, these people are so desperate, nobody's helping them, that mothers are now mixing detergent with water and force-feeding their babies to make them sick. Then they can take them to a hospital and get like free high-protein biscuits and things like that. Those are the things that they noticed. So it's like they had a different perspective. They didn't really speak to the people about their experiences of the fighting. They were like, actually, this is their experience, is that they're also renting out their babies to other women to go into the streets and beg, and then they share the profits. They call it profit-sharing scheme. So those are the things that they have decided are the stories of the war. So it's just different, and I think it's just great that they're doing that and that they're able to get these stories now on global media outlets.
And I think that's a perfect example of why it's important for all of us, because actually the more elevated these diverse voices are, the better stories we get, the better understanding you get of lives. And you know, it's a perfect example of how the Bilan woman came up with a far better story than I would have done if I was there, or any other kind of Western reporter. Does anyone else like to ask another question?
Yeah, hi. My name is Peter Young. I'm a freelance reporter, often in the Global South. I guess it's kind of similar themes to what Mary was just touching on then. But actually a question for Jamie, I suppose, as a foreign desk editor. I just wonder, there has been quite a bit of discussion about sort of the death of the foreign correspondent, and when talking about sort of decolonializing journalism, and I'd just be interested to know your thoughts on where the future of that is. And I suppose obviously there's benefits and disadvantages of the model that we have now, and where do you see that going, and what do you think the ideal is?
In terms of death of the foreign correspondent, I don't think we're there yet, to be honest. You know, I think, you know, foreign correspondent can still play a really important role, and of explaining the world in a kind of more helicopter view, perhaps, if you want to put it like that, which is, you know, obviously a lot of what our foreign news reporting does. So I think kind of, you know, the ideal for us right now is to have a foreign correspondent. You know, I mean, it's one thing we're certainly striving for is more diversity in our foreign correspondents. So that's one thing. But then, you know, making sure that they're working very closely with people on the ground, and then also having, as I said, this kind of second stream where we're commissioning people, you know, from these countries to write for us as well, so that we're kind of getting both perspectives. But I still think, personally, I think there's still a role for the foreign correspondent.
Claire Cousins from the Fuller Project. Just a follow-up to that question. As Mary alluded to earlier, I think, you know, there's been a lot of talk here and at other journalism conferences about who tells the stories, but the stories are still being overwhelmingly commissioned in the global north. And I speak as a British person living in London and commissioning stories from the global south. I'd be interested in the panelists' views on how we can address that issue, because we all come to it from our you know, we are not as diverse as we should be, right, as commissioning editors.
Absolutely, and I think although essentially we still are working in a Global North organisation where we have years of understanding of our readers and skills to curate what our organisation does best. You know, I do think that we mustn't lose sight of that, I guess. Would you agree with that, Jamie? Yeah. Mary, would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed on recent trips to the continent, including one last month to Ethiopia, is that Ethiopia has decided that it's going to launch a sort of multilingual global TV network. And they're starting off doing it in English, Arabic, and then they want to go into French and Kiswahili. And the current Prime Minister, he's obviously a very controversial figure. There's still basically a big war going on in Ethiopia, but he loves media, so he's poured lots of resources into a huge new media centre, and it's modelled on kind of Al Jazeera style. I went and visited it, and I mean, if those resources keep coming in and this is launched, that would just be a very interesting and important, I mean, even though Ethiopia is very repressive towards media, so it's not going to be very adventurous in its coverage, at least it's going to be doing that. I think it'll be really, really interesting. And also, in recent months, the BBC has lost a lot of its top reporters in Africa to the Turkish media, Turkish for Africa. They're going very big. I mean, they're obviously very involved in the continent, but it's interesting that that is happening, that you are beginning to see some media outlets saying, no, we're gonna be global as well. And it's tiny steps, but it looks like that kind of thing is happening. And I'm really fascinated to see, especially with the Ethiopian one, how they start reporting the world in these different languages.
Oh, have we got any other questions? I've lost sight of where the microphone's gone. No. Everyone happy? I mean, I'd quite like to ask the audience if anybody thinks we're missing something here. I mean, does anybody think that there's a really clear path to bringing more diverse voices in? Is there something that Western media could be doing that we're all oblivious to? Does anybody have a particular view? Sorry, could be at the microphone.
Hi. One other question I was just thinking about, because I had this discussion recently in the Netherlands, that there is also not a lot of investment in getting a more diverse trainings as journalists. So what I see in the universities and schools in the Netherlands, it's mostly white. Like, why are we not, what is our responsibility as newsrooms, as journalists, to make sure it changes there too? What is your view on that?
I mean, just from a Guardian perspective, you know, we are making an awful lot of effort to try and recruit more diverse staff. You know, kind of in terms of where we're trying to advertise, the language of our ads as they go out, the kind of way that we try and disseminate them. So, I mean, it is something that we're acutely aware of. We're not there yet, but it's certainly something that we're conscious of and we're trying to do something about.
I think what I have noticed is that the level of journalism has sort of deteriorated in the Caribbean and also in certain areas of Africa. And I think it's important to raise that level. One of my suggestions to The Guardian was that in terms of reparations for The Guardian's historic links, is maybe establish a school of journalism, where they can actually learn the trade and without negating the actual voices of locals. I think that'll be a significant project to start looking at.
Although, of course, we have to be quite careful not to look like colonials going in once again.
Yes, of course.
Hello. I think one angle that I'd be interested to hear about if you have experience in is also in diversifying the voices, the people who are at the table, in that it's not just the journalists. Like there's a kind of journalism that will always require a reporter looking for facts and you know, writing up a story. There's also a lot of innovation in journalism around thinking of media as convening communities and seeding the table, and so in the mic to people who are not journalists, that's also a way of diversifying and bringing other voices to the table, is accepting that the journalists is maybe more in the background, and that the communities that we're serving and writing for take the center stage. I wonder if you have experience in that.
But are you not doing away with the role of the journalist then?
No, not at all. It's just one of the many things that we do when we innovate in formats, and it's just as conveners of communities in kind of helping bring people together and giving them the platform.
At The Guardian we do that quite a lot. We have a kind of community team, they're called, and they do an awful lot of call-outs on particular stories. We've got one running on Sudan at the moment, asking people affected by what's going on there to let us know and talk to us. And that quite often the team that runs that, it ends up becoming a two-way conversation. So they may get a really interesting story in from somebody, they'll then try and either reach them by phone or speak to them, or just continue by email or WhatsApp or whatever, and just kind of try and build a story around that. So it's something I think we are trying to do, and we have had some really impactful stories as a result of that.
Hello. You mentioned briefly at the beginning that we should also have a more nuanced narrative regarding the good people, the bad ones, and I was wondering what you meant regarding this, and what would be an example of a context where it would be beneficial for the impact of the story.
In that question, I suppose I just meant an oversimplistic view where you have no nuances. You know, if you look at the war in Ukraine at the moment, I have seen some outlets in the US, for example, Russians are the bad guys, Ukrainians are the good guys, and that's it. And I think you do a disservice to your audience if you don't represent. Ukraine has a lot of problems with corruption, for example. There were tensions there which have gone back decades. If we don't share that context with the reader, then we do them a disservice. I think that's what I was getting at with the question. Does anybody else want, Mary?
Yeah, I'd just like to say something about the former comment about convening voices. I think as a broadcaster, the BBC is a very good platform or outlet to do that, and it does a lot of that, because I think it's easier to kind of convene lots of different voices when people are talking rather than you trying to write it all down. But I would also say that the role, I think that the role of the journalist has become even more important in these days of having these citizen journalists or everybody piling in on social media with their version of what's going on in the world, because the journalist's job is to filter all those voices and to kind of amass them, and with their professionalism and experience and the time they have to then check and to check again and to condense all those voices as best they can into something that is more balanced, accurate, etc. So some people say, oh, there shouldn't be journalists anymore because everybody can be a journalist. But that gives rise to all sorts, I mean, we all know what it gives rise to. So I feel that we do very much need journalists more than ever, even though they should work in a different way.
Thank you so much. I think, have we got time for one last question? Have we done? No, we haven't. We're done. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you so much. And I was going to thank everybody individually, but yeah, I won't. All right. Thank you.